Welcome to our Descartes module. Descartes, born in 1596 and dies in 1650, is one of the most important Western philosophers. Part of this distinction comes from the fact that he was a philosopher whose work signified the end of the medieval era and the start of the modern era. Our book gives us quite a bit of background on Descartes, but has one omission I would like to correct, and that is an omission of context. In 1517, Martin Luther named his famous 95 Theses to the door of a church and thus started the Protestant Reformation. The problem of the Reformation, in the non-religious sense, is that it caused quite a bit of political upheaval in Europe. At the time, the faith of the ruler was also the faith of his people. Well, they either made it their faith or there were some dire consequences. The start of the Reformation, once it became clear that the differences with the Mother Church were not about to be peacefully resolved, meant a war of the Church against the rebellious princes, and vice versa, for the salvation of the souls of those they ruled. Of course, the actual motivation was far more involved in issues like political power and taxation, but the salvation was a prominent official cause. So, in 1535, Henry VIII split off from the Catholic Church and started the Church of England, so that he could get divorced, remarried, and hopefully have a son, and no such luck despite 5 wives. The result was a conversion of the people ruled by their king, along with the forceful oppression, hunts for, and torture and execution of hidden Catholics throughout England. By the time Descartes was born, the various wars of Reformation had already ravaged much of Europe, but had hit something of a lull. From 1598 to 1618, things were relatively quiet, and then it all fell apart. In 1618, the 30 Years' War began, and that's one of the bloodiest wars in human history, linked below. More than 8 million dead, tens of thousands of villages and towns obliterated, and some parts of Europe lost more people than during the Black Plague. In that context, Descartes, writing about the certainty of knowledge, takes on an additional tone. His work is not just a philosophical musing about the nature of truth and human knowledge, it's also an attempt to work out the kinds of ideas that we can hold with absolute certainty, because those kinds of ideas are the only ones that we can coherently force onto other people. If we cannot tell the truth of a religious sectarian difference with the kinds of mathematical precision that Descartes is looking for, we cannot force people to be of this or that sect, or, more importantly, we cannot force them to do so rationally. That also means that whatever we can determine to be rationally clear and true is the kind of thing that should be believed and can be forced onto others, because the only reason for their denial would be their stubbornness, or an inability to reason to such an extent that those people should not be allowed to make decisions for themselves. Now, in the next chapter, we'll see how Locke used this kind of thinking to develop his ideas of religious tolerance. This kind of background is important to note because it means that Descartes' writings have teeth. They're not just nice ideas, they're existentially critical for the creation and maintenance of societies. Another thing to note, as we will throughout this lecture, is the similarity of Descartes' writing in Meditations to Ghazali, who wrote some 500 years earlier. The similarity is so striking that there is a bit of speculation on whether Descartes had been influenced or even borrowed from a translation of the text. This would certainly not be a novel development, as quite a bit of sharing had occurred between the Islamic world and the West, and quite frequently without citing sources. For more on that sharing, check the links in the description. The comparison is also interesting for the kind of differences it produces as a result of the different contexts of the two authors. Like Ghazali, Descartes is interested in getting the certainty of the mathematical variety. One way he thinks he can do this, in the mathematical realm, is by the reduction of the world to mathematical quantities through geometry. In his opening meditation, Descartes goes through the same motions as Ghazali. He introduces radical doubt into his knowledge. He notes that much of what he knows is from others, that he relies on senses and senses lie, and that he cannot distinguish between dreams and reality. One major difference is that Ghazali drills into the notion of reason and comes up empty-handed. That is, reason cannot be demonstrated to be reasonable. Descartes, on the other hand, more or less starts off with the assumption that reason can, at least in some cases, be trusted. Thus, his first conclusion, which is cogito ergo sum, I think I am, or I think therefore I am, is produced on the basis of rational thought. So Descartes argues that even if the universe conspired to make sure that every idea that I ever have is wrong, as soon as I am thinking, there must be an I which does the thinking. So a different way to think of this is that if there is an evil demon who is making sure that every idea I have is wrong, I still must exist so that the evil demon can trick me, because what is he tricking otherwise? All the experiences that happen to me, even if every one of them is false, still has to happen to me, and that means that there must be a me. The thing to notice here is that Descartes relies on a reason to establish the initial footing. The idea that I must exist, at least while I'm thinking, is an argument from rational premises. But Descartes simply makes that step without justifying it. Ghazali, on the other hand, goes specifically after that very notion, the idea that reason is reasonable. And the difference is that Descartes rolls on with the idea that some aspects of reason are unquestionable as a starting point. Ghazali, on the other hand, starts with the idea that all human knowledge is ultimately grounded in an assumption that we're forced to make, namely that reason works, at least sometimes. So how big is this difference? Well, think of it this way. Descartes accepts that reason is true. Ghazali merely shows that by the rules of reason, reason cannot justify our belief in reason, and so we have to assume it. The difference is that Descartes feels certain of the power of reason, and Ghazali acknowledges the tenuous position of reason as an assumption. Without that assumption, nothing works. Now, the practical outcomes are fairly close. Both Descartes and Ghazali can move on to the next stages of ideas and on to science and such, but with the additional nuance of Ghazali, we are always reminded that all we do is ultimately resting on a set of assumptions, and that our assumptions could ultimately be wrong. This reminder keeps us from blind adherence to any idea or ideology. The lack of this concept in Western thought had led to blind attachment to other ideas. Ideas like the world can be entirely reduced to quantifiable matter, and therefore anything we cannot measure and quantify does not exist. Turns out that plenty of things were not measurable or quantifiable until fairly recently, and there might be a whole lot more that we still haven't figured out how to do that with. So we went around claiming that something does not exist. We wrote that it does not exist in journals and books. We taught generations of new students that it does not exist and that believing in it would be silly, only to then have to backtrack and change our minds entirely. Next, Descartes goes on to argue for the existence of God. We won't take a lot of time with these arguments because they are rehashes of the old arguments, namely the ontological arguments of St. Anselm and the cosmological arguments of St. Aquinas. One uses definitions, the other argues against the reduction ad infinitum problem. One thing that bears noting, however, is that the ideas of nothingness and infinity are actually, historically speaking, religious ideas. In fact, they were developed in Hindu India as religious notions relating to God and are part of their revelation. So, in a way, Descartes is correct in arguing that man cannot come up with these notions on his own, since India is the only source of that notion, and it is a distinctly religious one. These ideas were then picked up by the Muslims and made their way to Europe, where they had a very serious religious impact. A great book on this topic is Zero, The History of a Dangerous Idea, link in the description. Our author has a few ideas at the end of the chapter that are worth considering. First, he says that the work of Descartes resulted in a secular world. What he means is something like, if we define the material world as a mechanistic world, then it is a world of laws and forces, and so God does not need to constantly intrude upon the creation. He designs it and lets it run. But that means that while it's running, it does so on a mechanical system. So you can study and understand the world entirely without any need to understand God. Now, the point I want to make here is that although this idea seems to have been very big news in the West, the rest of the world had apparently figured it out a long while before Descartes. The rest of the world religions, at least the major ones, did not see the intent of the Creator as a physical attribute, as something that can or should be measured. the purpose of the Creator was no more important to understanding the world than your intentions are necessary to mechanically describe the motion of your arm lifting a glass of water to your lips. The divine intent part only played a part in the kinds of things that religion asks of people in terms of prescriptive or normative issues. And these are issues like, how should we organize our society? How should we treat each other? What kind of laws should we have? Etc. These are essentially ethical or political issues, which do not reflect on the material of the material world. Where the two intersect is in the question, how should we, as individuals or societies, engage with science and research? The answer to this question, as we've seen in our list of civilizations, is a matter of where a society places its research emphasis, not whether it accepts or rejects science as such. Now that means that according to the whole host of other civilizations and religions, the idea that you can study the mechanics of the world in order to understand the world, and that you don't need to have the correct theological perspective, has been a given. So the rest of the major world thinkers historically agreed that 1, of course the material world is run by laws and forces rather than by incessant divine intervention. 2, of course the intentions of the divine are not calculable forces, other than possibly things like harmony or teleology, which still play out as mechanics. And 3, of course the soul is some kind of an immaterial entity which is not calculable because it is immaterial. Most crucial, of course, is the idea that reason is the basis of faith, not the other way around. Our author says that after Descartes, Europeans could no longer rely on the authority of popes, kings, or priests to tell them what to believe. Reason had to reign supreme, and it had to be the reason of each individual. The rest of the world's religions and thinkers would give our author a unanimous duh. The ability to believe A and not B is premised on the use of reason. The ability to hold on to a belief, any belief, and especially the correct theological belief, is based on reason. That is, quite literally, every single religious story. That's the very point of religions claiming miracles, and that's why proofs are offered. I'll give you 2 quick examples. The 10th century Andalusian thinker Ibn Masara, who died about 700 years before Descartes published his Meditation, lays it out like this. I have no direct access to the knowledge of God, or which religion, if any, is correct. Prophets claim to have this access to knowledge, presumably by the ability to see God and communicate with it in some way. But I do not have access to the knowledge in their prophetic heads, and so I can't tell if they're lying, are sincere but crazy, or have the truth. And therefore I cannot believe on the basis of revelation alone, because there are contradictory revelations. What I can do is evaluate the content of what the prophets claim and of what the revelation claims. But the only way I can make these evaluations is on the basis of reason. And therefore, reason is supreme, and reason is the universal measure of evaluation. Ghazali, in a later portion of his autobiography, sums it up like this. To believe A instead of B requires us to give a rational explanation and defense of A, because otherwise, why else would you not change your mind about what you believe? But if drawing this distinction between believing A or believing B requires us to use reason, then accepting A to begin with requires the exact same use of reason, because accepting any belief initially still means rejecting the belief in everything else. And therefore, reason is the basis for beliefs, not the other way around. Now, obviously, there is a starting component of assuming reason for Ghazali, but we all tend to do that anyway. Since each person is responsible for their own actions, provided that they are sane and adult and things like that, then the belief of every individual is or should be based on their own individual reason. So I cannot be Catholic for you, and you cannot be Hindu or Taoist for me. Self-responsibility means the individual use of reason. Now you can get this same point by reading Confucian texts and Taoist texts and Hindu texts and Buddhist texts, and even reading the Old and New Testaments will give you the same point. Yes, Descartes' work was very valuable to the development of the West, but it was not a particularly notable idea in most of the rest of the world. Obviously, our text focuses on the history of Western philosophy, and again, that's perfectly fine, but I feel that given the oomph that Descartes gets, and rightly so, it should be noted how that idea ranked with the rest of the world at the time. Finally, we should take a second to note the question of the mind and body separation that's introduced by Descartes. You may not fully grasp why this is a big deal, so let's just cover it very quickly. Most people tend to think that the mind equals the brain. It seems simple, and you don't have to grapple with the problems of immaterial minds and all that. But there is a massive problem here. If the mind is just the brain, and the brain is merely matter, and all matter behaves in a way that can be calculated out ahead of time because of the laws and rules of how matter behaves, then you are a predetermined and pre-programmed machine. That means that you have no free will, because it can't be free if it is predetermined, and it must be predetermined because all matter is. If you have no free will, that means that there is no accountability and no responsibility, and therefore no morality. And as a result, rape is just as good as saving orphans from a burning building. That's not really the way we want to go, so that option is out. But if the mind is different than the brain, if the mind is immaterial, then we have a different massive problem. We understand how matter interacts with matter. Both are law-governed, both are calculable, because both have shared properties of material objects. But how does something which shares no properties with your brain, which is the material object, interact with it? We have no idea. In fact, we can't even come up with a theoretical explanation. You may have an immaterial mind, and you may have a material body, but those two cannot work together in any way. As far as we know, there is no solution to this problem. You can pick either side, and there are plenty of arguments for and against each position. Part of the problem is that as soon as we label the mind to be an immaterial thing, our sciences say that it cannot exist, because we cannot measure and quantify it. But we have not been able to measure or quantify a lot of things, including gravity, for a very long time. In fact, Leibniz, one of the inventors of calculus, argued against the idea of gravity proposed by Newton, the other inventor of calculus, because he saw the idea of invisible action over distance without some kind of a medium connecting the objects as entirely irrational. So there may be some hope that in the future we will be able to square this particular circle. What we do know at the moment is that the material world can seem to affect the mind, whatever that is. Intoxicants cloud your reason, and torture may lead to insanity. But we also see that the immaterial objects, those would be mere ideas without any kind of a physical substance, can affect the material world. Being insulted tends to raise our blood pressure. It releases adrenaline, it triggers a flight or fight reflex, and makes Hulk very mad. Soothing a person has the opposite effect, and so we get Hulk sleep. PTSD is what happens when an idea triggers a rather serious physical reaction. And finally, just to bring in some physics into this, there is a link below for the physics double slit experiment, which is absolutely insane, because what it says is that reality seems to care about whether or not there is a conscious mind observing it. In any case, you will notice quite a bit of reference to Descartes as we go forth into the modern and contemporary philosophers. Pay close attention to how these arguments stack on one another, and how an idea that was intended for one purpose can suddenly become the driving force for heading in the completely opposite direction.